Good morning. We are now, having come through Holy Week, beginning our new expositional series on the book of Deuteronomy. It was something that I'd alluded to about a month ago, or maybe a bit more than that now. So something that I'd been working on for about 2 months, going back 2 months now, probably nearly 3 months by this point, coming not necessarily on the recommendation of others, but rather in consort with the desire that I had heard from a number of you in regards to learning more about the law of God. That stood to me more as a confirmation that my preparations, which I'd already been doing for about a month by that point, were probably on the right track, and this was a good direction for us to head in regards to our upcoming preaching. The book of Deuteronomy is a vitally important book, not just in what we call the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. It is not only important to the Old Testament, but it is also vitally important to the entirety of Scripture. It's vitally important to the New Testament. It's quoted almost ad infinitum in the New Testament. We've heard a number of early portions of this book of Deuteronomy, which were quoted in the passages that we've had read to us from Acts chapter 7, which is the final speech of the proto-martyr, St. Stephen, who was the first martyr of the church. And he has been given this chance to provide a defense for himself about how he is not a follower of Christ, nor has he been preaching that he is God in the flesh. And he launches most powerfully into this incredible speech for that essentially 50 verses that we've had read there from Acts chapter 7, wherein he explains to, in this case particularly, the Jewish council, the Jewish religious leadership, the entire history of the people of God, going back in this case to Abraham, and running them through all the history of their people. It's something that later in Acts, as our Bible study students know, as we're going through the book of Acts, that occurs elsewhere as well. We've seen even just recently on Paul's first missionary journey into the land that we call today Turkey, that we have the apostle himself doing a very similar thing, not in as grand an exposition, in this case of the martyr Stephen, but he does so by going through the history of the people and demonstrating to them that Christ is the fulfillment of the very Abrahamic covenant that was made, so many from their perspective, thousands of years ago. This covenant that God made with this one man, Abraham, which was even ancient in the days of Christ and the apostles, even more so ancient to us. A bulk of that covenant, especially in its major iteration in the days, in this case the final days, of Moses, one of the other seminal figures of the Old Testament, serves as a fundamental core of this great covenant that weaves its way through the pages of the Bible, that goes back even beyond Abraham himself, going back to this initial promise made in the earliest chapters of the book of Genesis to Adam and Eve. Adam being the first high priest, so it were, our federal head as it's referred to, the one who represented all of humankind that would then come from him. And in his fall and in the fall of the woman, we fell from this grace of God. This communion that had existed between man and God was now broken. This beautiful paradise that was this garden in Eden in ancient times, which served as the proverbial temple of God on earth, this place where God and the heavenly host would commune with man, was now shattered. And indeed, man was now exiled from this temple garden, this place where the full communion between God and man, full relationship existed in perfect harmony. And from that point, though, man is not left in destitution, of course, as we know. There is the promise that comes, and it has to do with this Old Testament imagery called the seed, right? Seed, thinking seed like a plant, but also seed, in this case, the seed of humanity, right? Children, offspring. And in simple terms, it says that the seed of the woman, a descendant who would be himself human, would crush the head of this serpent, this ancient one, this fiery bronze serpent, to use the broad Old Testament language, that's so weaved and deceived into the minds and the souls of first the woman and then the man. that his head would be crushed, that he would be defeated, that his deception and his power would be ultimately broken. But even in that act, that the heel of this seed of the woman would also be bruised. Bruised yet not killed. We see this fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ himself. And it's from that point then that these earliest chapters of Genesis kind of follow their way through, particularly following this line of Seth, who was one of the children of Adam and Eve, and then this line of Cain, who was the great murderer, who murdered his own brother Abel in those ancient times. And this story plays out all the way through to the great flood, to the justice that was brought upon the great wickedness of mankind and his perversions in so many ways, and then follows through the kind of new Adam, in that sense, Noah and his family, where the covenant was renewed with him, the dominion mandate, as we call it in theology, the command to go forth into the world and to take dominion, to subdue the earth and to be fruitful and multiply, have lots of children and have lots of descendants, is given to Noah again, kind of afresh. But just like the first time, where indeed a fruit stood at the centre of sin, now again with this proverbial new Adam, a new fruit, that of the fruit of the vine. The wine stood at the centre of Noah's fall. And so sin has not been dealt with. Mankind still exists in this state of rebellion, this covenant unfaithfulness, despite God's enduring faithfulness. And this follows its way through the book of Genesis, which is covering such a massive amount of time, thousands upon thousands of years. And we follow our way through to Abraham, this one man, again a descendant of the same line. And it's in that instance that Abraham is then approached by God. And amidst all of the great stories that we have, particularly from those middle to later chapters of the book of Genesis, it is built upon this seminal event, this seminal moment in the book of Genesis, wherein, like with Adam, like with Noah, God makes a promise to Abraham. And to paraphrase, he says that through your family, through your seed, through your line, shall all the nations of earth be blessed. And he says and shows him, he says, go outside, and he has Abraham look up into the beauties of the night sky and says that your descendants shall be innumerable as the stars in the heavens. And through your descendants, that will eventually be more than just your ethnic family, as we know as we work our way through the Old Testament and then particularly into the New, that indeed all the nations of earth were going to be blessed through the descendants of this one man, Abraham. But he tells Abraham, he says, that your family, your descendants, will be enslaved by the Egyptians, and they will dwell in slavery in Egypt for centuries on end, right, for about 400 years. And then it comes down to this figure Moses. And so now we're moving into the book of Exodus. And it's therein, as we had accounted to us 2,000 years ago by Stephen, the first martyr of the church, that indeed Moses was called by God. And he was called to this incredible scene at the burning bush, where God reveals to him his name and his presence, that he is the God of Abraham and his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, who is known also as Israel, which is where the name comes from. And he reminds him of the covenant, the promise that he made with Abraham nearly half a millennium prior to Moses himself. Something that seemed so long ago for a people that had dwelt in the brutality of slavery in this kingdom which was the most powerful nation on earth. And indeed he says that I will bring my people out of slavery just as I promised Abraham. And so Moses goes back forth, and we had those details accounted to us, of course. There's this kind of climactic instance in which he finds an Egyptian soldier beating upon a Jewish man, an Israelite. And in righteousness and in justice, he comes to the aid of that poor and oppressed Israelite, and he kills the Egyptian soldier. This causes him to flee. He goes out into the east, and then eventually, though, he comes back. And we find then from that point that he then leads the people of Israel out of Egypt. He partitions the great Pharaoh to release God's people, to let his people go, and the Pharaoh, in his blindness and in his hubris, his pride, his stubbornness, his hardness of heart, as the kind of scriptures refer to it, right? The hardness of his will. He says no. And so God brings judgment upon Egypt, successive judgments, in fact, that are really not even as much about bringing the message to Pharaoh as much as it is to the broader context of Egypt, by specifically attacking and going after these seminal motifs, these kind of key images and sections of Egyptian culture and life that pertain to their respective gods, and demonstrating the fact that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is infinitely more powerful than these lesser gods, so it were. And eventually, after the 10th and great plague, an act of justice, keeping in mind, as so many of you know, that many decades prior, the Pharaoh had murdered all of the new firstborn boys of the Israelites, this great infanticide, that is to say, a genocide of infants. This is the instance in which Moses escaped this down the Nile River in a basket, reminiscing not only to his predecessor Noah, but also picturing forth other imagery as well. And so herein in this 10th plague, this 10th judgment upon the Pharaoh, the firstborn of Egypt are killed. But the Israelites are told, as many of you remember, to do what? Paint blood of a lamb upon their doorposts, the framing of their house. And this angel of death sent by God to bring justice upon Egypt would pass over them. This is where this festival of the Passover comes in. The Passover, and this very thing which we continue to remember and be the recipients of the grace of through Holy Communion. And then at that point, of course, the Pharaoh lets the people go. They flee, but 5 minutes later, the Pharaoh changes his mind in his arrogance. He pursues, and any military strategist would tell you, generally speaking, do not pursue a retreating enemy for the reason that you run into an ambush. And thus he did in the crossing of the Red Sea, and he and the Egyptian army drowned. And this is working our way through the book of Exodus, okay, and coming up to this seminal and incredible event called, in the book of Exodus, the events at Mount Sinai. We have this famous giving of the 10 Commandments, which are particularly located in the broader section of this covenant in Exodus chapters 20 and 23, through that portion. This stands as the kind of foundation of this covenant that was being made with Moses and with these people, the Israelites. They're there for about a year. It doesn't go terribly well because of the fact that when Moses is up upon Mount Sinai, the people freak out, even though they can probably see the great wonders and the thunder and the lightning going on upon the mountain. They nevertheless freak out and say, we want to go back to Egypt, be more comfortable in Egypt. Aaron, brother of Moses, make for us an idol, a golden calf statue in this case, right? That we can worship as the God that brought us out of Egypt. Because that's what we're used to, that's what we're comfortable with, that's what we're familiar with from Egypt, right? This, of course, is a great offence against God. Why? For the same reasons that it's been an offence against God all the way through the book of Genesis. God demonstrates his faithfulness to mankind, that he himself does not change, that he is indeed loving and gracious and merciful and abounding in covenant faithfulness, but nevertheless people continue to break it. And this demonstrates that indeed with the Israelites, that story, unfortunately, shall continue. It's from that point that we then arrive kind of at the tail end of that book where this tabernacle is described, right? This place that would form kind of like a new Eden, immaculately and meticulously described in all of its dimensions and all of its characteristics, that would serve as the dwelling place of God among the people, just like it was in Eden. Moses kind of goes up to enter that tabernacle, and we find then that he can't. He can't, because of the holiness of God and because of the sin of mankind in the face of that holiness. They were unclean. They were not worthy. They were unable to enter the presence of the pure and holy God. This is the big problem. If the whole plan here, right, is to reunite God with man in full communion, just like they had in the garden, this ancient temple, how then can we reconcile this issue of the fact that by sin and by covenant rebellion and unfaithfulness, man cannot actually commune with God properly because he is holy and blameless and free of sin? Right? You see the problem? We're told this because the very next book, that of Leviticus, says and opens with the fact that God calls forth to Moses from the tent. God in the tent, Moses outside it, and so he calls to him from the tent. And fortunately, we then get this book of Leviticus, which is perhaps one of the most ignored books by modern Western evangelicals, because it seems so fidgety, it seems so minute, it seems so foreign almost to our modern Western post-Enlightenment sensibilities. But the book of Leviticus is an incredible blessing, and it was an incredible blessing because indeed it was paving the way for the people of God, despite their sin, to actually be able to enter the presence of God, to actually be in communion with him. And it was demonstrating that to them. It was demonstrating also the need for cleansing, the need for regeneration, the need for renewal. Right? And it functions in this sense of having kind of this core that is then surrounded by three concentric circles on each side, right? Before and after, before and after, before and after, right? And the breakdown of all these images and incredible symbols that serve in these practical forms to remind people of the people of God of their sins before God, and then the need for cleansing and ways in which this would be done. We then work our way through that and then arrive at the beginning of the very next book, Numbers, which begins with God talking to Moses in the tent. Not from, now in. So yay for the book of Leviticus. And Numbers now describes this wandering through the wilderness of the people of God for 40 years. They'd been at Mount Sinai for a year, where these events of the later portions of Exodus as well as Leviticus take place. And then now they are to embark, heading north, roughly speaking, up to the eastern side of the Jordan River, where they would then cross into the land of Canaan, the land that we call the Promised Land, because it was promised to Abraham all those centuries ago. This promise that was made to him, that his people would dwell in this blessed land, and from that point they would be a blessing to all the nations of earth. The book of Numbers is called so because it begins with a census of the people, where all the tribes are numbered, right? And without going into great depth, because it's a thorough and deep book that has a lot of history, that 40-year journey doesn't exactly go well. And by not going well, I mean it's an absolute dumpster fire on top of a train wreck in the middle of a burning forest. You see this great rebellion of the people where, in true democratic spirit, they decide that they want to elect a new leader who's not called Moses because they're sick and tired of hunger and thirst, and it's not Egypt, and it's too uncomfortable and unfamiliar with this, and it's this rebellion against God. There's even a greater rebellion by the Levites, by the priests, called the rebellion of Korah, and God deals with that swiftly. But despite the continuous rebellions of the people who are whining and whinging and moaning, even though they have been literally saved from slavery, God maintains his covenant faithfulness. And so really the entire Pentateuch, these first 5 books of the Bible is the grand historical exposition and accounting of man's consistent rebellion and disobedience and unfaithfulness and disloyalty in the face of God's continuous faithfulness and his continuous loyalty. The fact that he does not change in his attributes nor actions, that he is consistent in his love, consistent in his devotion, consistent in his faithfulness and his grace and his mercy. You even have portions in the book of Numbers, in this wanderings of the people for 40 years, wherein they're moving through the land of Moab, fighting, bickering, complaining, blaspheming, rebelling. And meanwhile, you have the king of Moab, who has essentially hired a pagan warlock to curse the people. And you find then that even still in the midst of that, God is protecting them from that, from this warlock named Balaam. So while the people are rebelling and groveling down here, up in the hills, up in the mountains, in the sacred places for the pagans, God is actually not only protecting them, but also continuing to bless them. And then we arrive at this 5th and final book of the Pentateuch, called Deuteronomy. It's important that we have understood what I've been expounding here, because, as it should be obvious, none of these books are written in a vacuum. They're not written in isolation. They didn't just kind of descend kind of on a golden chariot out of the heavens in some grand Hollywood fashion. All right? They're written in a very important historical context. And they're part of an overall literary journey through history. And so you can't understand the book of Deuteronomy without at least having a fundamental or a basic grasp of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Right? It's important to have that. Because we then arrive at this book of Deuteronomy. Because of the sin and the rebellion of this generation who consistently whinged and moaned and were unfaithful and broke the covenant that they'd made with God, they were then punished by not being allowed to enter into the promised land. Okay, this is straight justice. And instead now, in Deuteronomy, the focus or the attention turns to the new generation, right? The generation that had been born in the wilderness as they'd been journeying through for this time period. And what we have in Deuteronomy, and what the focus here this morning is going to be, is just to simply give you an understanding of its outline. We're not diving into any particular text, because you need to kind of understand, just like with the other ones, how is this book actually constructed? Because it's constructed with a purpose that's there, that explains to us certainly the locution and the illocution of the author. That means the authorial intent. Why was it written this way? And that then helps us understand as a framework, right, a scaffolding, how we can then read the book. In simple terms, it's built around a core, in one sense like Leviticus is, okay, but just with not as many sections or derivations. Deuteronomy is built around what we call the Deuteronomic Code, which is chapters 12 to 26. Okay, 12 to 26. You might be wondering, why on earth is this book called Deuteronomy? What does that name mean? What does that word mean at all, right? It comes to us from the Greek, okay? Deuteronomos, from 2 words. Deuteros, second, nomos, law. Second law. Not because it's a different law, but because here it is the second giving of it, okay? It's the new generation that's in focus here, the generation that is basically in final preparations to cross the Jordan and invade Canaan. So this is the new generation that now needs to hear the history of the people, like what Stephen gave, right? As well as a kind of renewal of the covenant that had been broken by their own parents through the wilderness. And so it's a second giving of the law, a second giving of the covenant, hence second law, Deuteronomy, okay? And so built around that Deuteronomic code, as we call it in theology, chapters 12 to 26, we find an opening speech and then a final speech, right, in order to make 3 separate speeches. The first 11 chapters serve as this first proverbial speech. Right? Moses begins in chapter 1, and those are the verses that we're going to be working on in the next sermon, right? These opening verses of chapter 1, wherein he explains the Torah, right? That's the Hebrew word for the law. He explains the law to the new generation, right? This covenant between God and his people that here is being renewed. And there's a command, and there's been plenty of commands. There's been commands through Exodus, there's been commands through Leviticus, through Numbers as well. And here we come again to another command, another call to the people to be faithful to the covenant that was made with God. Right? The consistent thread through the Pentateuch is covenant faithfulness. It's upon the backdrop of man's covenant unfaithfulness and God's consistent faithfulness. But here again, Moses is calling this new generation. Don't fall into the failures of your parents, of your predecessors. Be faithful to the covenant that God has made with you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has brought you out of the house of Egypt, this house of slavery. It's a call to covenant faithfulness. And that concept, right, a call to covenant faithfulness, will be one of the big driving kind of theological reasons for our own exposition of this book of Deuteronomy. Right, I'll mention more about that towards the end, okay? But as I mentioned, chapters 1 to 11 are this opening speech of Moses. He reviews and kind of summarizes at least the kind of big picture details of Israel's history, particularly from the Exodus itself and through the wanderings, right? He's giving to the new generation the kind of highlight package of what God has done thus far, having brought them out of the land of Egypt and out of slavery in the Exodus, and then through this 40 plus years now, through the wilderness and the deserts of the Near East, right? He's giving them context. Just like I've given you context, he is giving them context, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. He's explaining to the new generation the past. That alone, and this point will be made, but tells us that it is always so vitally important for us to know the past. We must know the things that have come before. We must study that which is ancient. Because when you isolate a people from that which is ancient, when you isolate people from the past and from the story and the heritage and the legacy that is built up to their own point in history, like ours now, when you cut people off from that, you can redefine pretty much everything. You can redefine their identity, you can redefine their values, their beliefs, and their culture. That is what you are seeing in Western civilization now. We sort of kind of teach history, but not really. We have history classes that are taught by people who are not historians in ways that don't amount to anything even remotely approaching an elementary level of history. That is not by mistake. This tells us the importance of studying history. It's why we, again, have our own church history classes, because we as Christians must know the history of the kingdom of God. To be able to know our place in it, to be able to understand where we are in that story, we must likewise understand the great and incredible blessing of the heritage that we are now ourselves custodians of, that we are also called to pass on to our descendants. We do this by studying, and it's never been easier than in the days of the internet, where you don't have to have gone and acquired a PhD in history and travelled all around the world looking hopefully for a document that tells you anything about something ancient. No, with all but a couple of clicks and keystrokes, you can access entire libraries worth of knowledge and of history. This is the point of these opening chapters. Right, it breaks down in kind of 1 to 4, which is where, as I said, he continues to demonstrate that God has brought justice to the people. Right? He hasn't just let sin just go willy-nilly and unpunished. No, rebellion and lawlessness has brought justice, which is good and righteous. But it's not justice without hope. It's not justice without mercy and grace, because even in the midst of justice, grace and mercy still expound and expand. We think of justice as somehow opposite to mercy or grace. In fact, it's not. Justice itself is a grace and is in itself often a mercy. And so this section concludes with an overview of the covenant that is being renewed with this new generation. Chapters 5 through 11, the other subsection of this first speech, right, kind of begins after a second introduction in the end of chapter 4 technically, right? But then by the time we get to chapter 5, the events at Mount Sinai are then recounted themselves specifically with the giving of the 10 Commandments, right? And so this is the giving of the ethical Decalogue, as it's referred to, Decalogue meaning the 10 laws, right? And so this is what we think of when we think of the 10 Commandments. We think particularly of Exodus chapter 20, which is the first instance in which they're given. They're repeated here in Deuteronomy as well. And also the repetition of the fact that particularly as they enter this promised land, they are to remain faithful to Yahweh. They are not to engage in the idolatrous worship of false gods or of lesser gods of the peoples. They are not to bow down before statues and images of these gods. They are not to break the covenant, right? And he's really stressing this home. And this subsection, as well as this first speech of chapters 1 through 11, is kind of built around the axis, so it were, of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which we call, using the Hebrew word, the Shema. Okay? Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. It's a defining statement of many things, monotheism being among them, but as well as many other things that again we'll unpack when we get to that particular verse itself. Okay? But it serves basically as the kind of motto of the covenant, right, and becomes a very important centerpiece of not only the book of Deuteronomy, but then of course going all the way through the rest of the Bible itself, right? So that'll be an important section that we then cover. It speaks to who God is, and this wording of here, just to give you a little teaser, speaks to not just having it come into your ears, but it speaks particularly in the Hebrew to listening and obeying. Okay, that's what the word really drives at. We'll cover that when we get into it. And so this covers the broad details of this first section, this first speech to the new generation, chapters 1 to 11. As I said, it then moves into the Deuteronomic code, right, the law that is given in chapters 12 through 26. That'll be a vitally important part, particularly to us here now, as the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant that is fulfilled in Christ and by extension from Christ to us. Okay? It's one of the important reasons why we're going to be expositing this particular book, because we often think that the law is somehow antagonistic to grace. It's like in opposition somehow. Whereas that is not even remotely close at all in any way, shape or form to how it's presented in the New Testament. In fact, the Apostle Paul makes this point explicitly clear. Right? To paraphrase the Apostle, he says, fundamentally, do not think that simply because we're under grace that the law is somehow gone, that it's been abolished, that it's just been kind of done away with, that doesn't matter anymore. We're just under this nice vibe of grace, right? Instead, indeed, do not think that you can just go on sinning because grace abounds. No, indeed, we are saved from the punishment and the curse of the law, the fact that we can't perfectly maintain it and uphold it, as God himself is perfect and holy. But instead, we are saved unto works of the law. More on that later. But what we have in this particular section is what we would call the kind of terms of the covenant, right? The terms of this relationship that has been outlined going back through these earlier books of the Old Testament and of the Pentateuch specifically. The core is built around the covenant code, which again is reflecting the Decalogue, the ethical Decalogue given back in Exodus 20 at Mount Sinai itself, and that serves again as the core upon which the rest revolves. There are what I suppose you could broadly call new laws, right? Not new in the sense that they contradict, but new in the sense that they are expanding upon that ethical decalogue, as well as, of course, the laws that were given for particularly the priesthood and the civil leaders in the book of Leviticus, okay? What we call these customary or ritual laws, right? And so when we get into the weeds of the Deuteronomic Code, chapters 12 through 26, we will encounter no shortage of times in which verses and paragraphs will seem largely, if not entirely, utterly foreign to your modern Western minds. We live in a vastly different time with vastly different technology and vastly different culture, at least kind of on the surface level, right? But you will find some incredibly important theology that is to be drawn from that Deuteronomic Code, particularly things that can then be applied in their principle even to our day. It's what we call the general equity of the law. I explain more about this phrase when we get into it. It's a phrase that comes from particularly the Westminster Confession as well as the London Baptist Confession. The general equity of the law, and we see an example of that in the New Testament, in the writings of the Apostle Paul, where he says to the Corinthians, "Do not muzzle the ox while it treads." This is an individual law that's found in the Deuteronomic Code, and he's using it in reference to ministers, right, being paid for their religious service. And of course, the mind perhaps on the prima facie level goes, how on earth does not muzzling an oxen somehow relate to ministers being paid for their devotion to God and for their service to the church? Well, what he is doing there is taking the spirit of the law, right? This spirit of the law that Christ, of course, famously often refers to in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere as well, right? You have heard it said, da-da-da-da, but I say to you, da-da-da-da, right? Showing the spirit or the intent, the general equity of the law that is behind the actual written word of the law, right? You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you hate another man in your heart, you have already murdered him, right? That's the spirit of the law, the general equity. And the general equity applies beyond just merely the written words. That's why it is so erroneous, and not only just erroneous in the kind of the ethereal intellectual sense, it is culturally and societally damaging to think that the law of God has somehow vanished or been abrogated or doesn't apply anymore. There are obvious agrarian things that do not apply in our post-industrial revolution society. But we shall not, and indeed cannot, and indeed must not fall into the trap of thinking that the spirit of the law, the general equity of it, doesn't apply to us, of all people, nations which have a long-standing heritage of Christianity. And so it's built around these kind of four subsections. Again, we're not going to go into deep detail because that'll be when we get into it, right? But it begins with chapters 12 through 16a, so like the first half of 16, where the laws are given for governing Israel's worship, right, as a very broad category. It moves on to the latter half of 16 to chapter 18, which speaks particularly about the appointment of civil and religious leaders. And it's herein that we find these incredible rules that are given that clearly demonstrate that indeed the magistrates, the kings, the clan chiefs, right, so the chiefs of families, as well as even the tribal chiefs themselves, are all under the authority of the law and the prophets. And that even in Israel, the king was not divine, nor was he a law unto himself. I wonder if that might have any possible application in our day. It moves through chapters 19 to 25, where the laws of kind of social regulation, right, civil laws are given, and then finishes with chapter 26, which is the laws for basically the confession of identity and loyalty, right, the kind of identity as the covenant people of God, right? This is the Deuteronomic Code, chapters 12 to 16. And then it finishes with this final speech of Moses, where he is in his latter years, he's in his latter time, of course, as we've seen going back to the beginning. It's the new generation that he's speaking to. And from chapters 27 to 28, he gives an explanation to the new generation about covenant blessings and cursings, right? Here's the blessings of God that come from obeying and upholding the covenant of God, right? It's not this ruthless, enslaving taskmaster. It is the very fruit of blessing. It is indeed the wellspring of goodness and justice in society, right? It is fundamentally good to operate this way, right? And here are the curses that will befall you if you violate it. Because when you violate the law of God, when you move outside the order of God that he himself has created and formed in the world, you will exist in chaos. The opposite of light is darkness. The opposite of order is chaos. Hence why we say so often, particularly in our modern day, that we will either have Christ or we will have chaos. You will have God and his ways and his law, his covenant, or you will, by very definition, exist outside of order, which is itself outside of, therefore, goodness and love and justice and holiness and righteousness, which is itself darkness and therefore chaos. Chapters 29 and 30 kind of conclude this discourse, right, that is being given here in the land of Moab before they then cross the Jordan. Right? And again, Moses calls the people, particularly the new generation, to commit themselves to faithfulness unto God as a nation, that they would stand apart from their pagan neighbours, who for a very long time by this point have been committed and devoted to these other false gods. That indeed their laws would serve as the wellspring and the fount of blessing unto the nations, kind of hearkening back to this promise given to Abraham that through him, through his seed, that is to say his family, his descendants, all the nations of earth would be blessed. And then this final subsection, chapters 31 to 34, he gives a final warning to them, right? Particularly of what has happened over the previous decades with their predecessors. He gives what's called the poem of warning in chapter 32, and then the poem of blessing in chapter 33. And then that final chapter, chapter 34, finishes with Moses himself going up upon Mount Nebo. Like the people had been themselves punished for their covenant unfaithfulness and been barred from entering the land, one of the events from earlier books that we find is that when the people are thirsty, God is going to bless them, right? He's going to cause water to come forth from this rock. It's a miraculous supernatural event, but it's designed that way for a purpose, to show them that he is God and that he provides even out of a dry rock. But what Moses does in that instance, in his anger, rightfully, in terms of, or at least understandably so, but nonetheless inexcusably so, he strikes the rock, which is not what was commanded to do. He was told to speak to the rock, right? Command water to come forth. He strikes the rock with his staff, which he'd been famously carrying around with him, and then says, to paraphrase, "You stupid, rebellious people, must we bring forth water from this rock?" Ooh. We? You and God? I don't think so. Unfortunately, Moses himself fell into the same covenant unfaithfulness, not only as the people, but also as his predecessors, like Noah, like Adam. Again, this is weaving its way across the course of thousands of years of human history, that we're seeing these instances in which they occur. And it's from that likewise justice comes against Moses as well. He too will not be allowed to enter the promised land that he, for decades and decades, had been leading the people toward as this kind of quasi-prophet king, so it were. But God is gracious and merciful, abounding in covenant faithfulness, even to the 1,000th generation. We find these words in these opening books of the Bible. And so he takes Moses up upon Mount Nebo, this high mountain. He shows him all the promised land, all the way across to the Mediterranean Sea that we would refer to, right? And he shows him all the wonders of the land and sees the beauty of it. This great act of kindness and mercy to God's servant. Though he would not enter the promised land, he was given the gracious gift of being taken up to the high places, one more time upon a mountain, just as he had been before, decades ago, upon the holy mountain of Mount Sinai. And now he would look upon this beautiful land, which was referred to using this kind of common imagery from the day, right, the land of milk and honey. And he sees it, and it's in that instance that he then dies upon that mountain. And the book of Deuteronomy chapter 34 finishes with the kind of later scribal kind of rounding off of the book, where we obviously see the death of Moses, right? He obviously didn't write about his death, in case anyone was wondering. That comes from the normal pattern of biblical formation, which is where it's not just done by Moses sitting down at a desk like we would do it or typing it out, right? There's a whole host of scribes which are writing it out and compiling it and so on. And it finishes with the death of Moses, right? It finishes with that scribal conclusion. This is the broad outline of this incredible, rich, beautiful and fruitful book that is the book of Deuteronomy. And as I said, there will be so many lessons that we will learn as we go through. But one of, definitely not the only, but one of, to conclude on this point, one of the biggest points that is to be drawn from this particular exposition of Deuteronomy is this: the law of God is good and wise. The law of God is good and wise, as the old Lutheran hymn says. Right? It is the wellspring of goodness. It is the fountain of righteousness. It is a blessing not only to God's people, but to the nations, which are then being, and have been for 2,000 years and counting, brought into the people of God, that have been granted citizenship into the kingdom of God. And that we are, I would submit, currently suffering, and have been progressively so for about 300 years, by the gradual but progressive movement away from the law of God and from its authority, not only in individual lives like we like to do, right? We are in a very hyper-individualistic culture where salvation, to use the broad term, is about you praying a prayer and kind of proverbially punching your ticket to heaven. And then you join the social club and you sing nice songs and do nice things and have nice morning teas and give money to charity. And then we're just kind of in limbo, just like kind of waiting until the really good part starts, which is when we die and go to heaven. That general ethos pervades far too great a percentage of Western evangelicalism. Instead, as the history of the church so testifies to, the people of God going forth, expanding Christ and his kingdom, have done so by going forth and giving the incredible blessing and invitation to the pagan nations, that indeed they are no longer enslaved to darkness, that the powers of evil have been shattered. They are not eliminated, they are not completely gone from the world, but their power and their stronghold, as in ancient times, has been broken. That Christ, upon his death and particularly his resurrection, has shattered that authority, and indeed all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. That we are therefore to go and make disciples of the nations. We ourselves, and virtually every person in this room, is a living testimony to the fact that God has fulfilled his covenant with Abraham. We are the nations. and you stand in the land of the nations. And that the law of God, which is the very core and the foundation of his covenant, is a blessing and is the very precondition for human flourishing and for human blessing. That is one of the many lessons that we will take from what will be an incredible journey through this expository series on the book of Deuteronomy. You will also have the advantage of being able to keep up with what we're doing. There won't necessarily be a need for a series guide like we've done in some of our more topical series, because if we say, for example, cover verses 1 to 5, then guess where we're starting the next week? Verse 6. And it will provide a consistency of teaching and of growth week in, week out as we work our way through. Okay? This is the book of Deuteronomy. Amen.